In a town where even the grocer slides your coins across the counter with a yardstick, because touching your hand might let the sin rub off, a woman still walks down the center of the street every single morning. She carries her dignity like a shield. She holds her chin level. She says good morning to the people who won't answer. For 3 years, Abigail Preston has been the pariah of Dusty Creek, blamed for a fraud she didn't commit, starved of her standing, her friends, her name. She could leave. She has been offered a way out. And the reason she stays, the secret she has been protecting with her own suffering, will break something open in your chest that you didn't even know was locked. If this story moved something in you, drop a comment and tell me the moment that broke you the widest open.
The wind blowing through Dusty Creek always tasted like dry dirt and old secrets. It was 1878, a hard year for Texas. Abigail Preston turned the key in the lock of her small seamstress shop. The sky above was still bruised purple, not yet willing to let the sun break through. Abby liked the dark. She liked the quiet before dawn. It was the only time the town didn't stare. She stepped off her porch and walked down the dusty street toward the general store. The town was waking up. A few ranch hands tipped their hats to each other. But when Abby walked by, the street grew quiet. A mother pulled her little boy by the collar, stepping off the boardwalk to avoid crossing Abby's shadow. Abby kept her eyes forward. She didn't shrink. She didn't hurry. The bell above the general store clattered. Martha Higgins stood behind the long wooden counter. The older woman stopped wiping the wood. Her face tightened into a hard, sour knot. 10 pounds of flour, please, Abby said. Her voice was steady, quiet. Martha didn't say a word. She fetched the heavy canvas sack, dropped it onto the counter with a loud thud. A small cloud of white dust puffed into the air between them. Abby reached into her coin purse. She set the silver down on the polished wood. Martha didn't reach for the money. Instead, she picked up a wooden yardstick. She pressed the tip against the silver coins and slid them slowly across the counter, dropping them off the edge into her apron pocket. God forbid she accidentally brush against Abigail Preston's skin. God forbid the sinner's touch rub off on her. Abby didn't flinch. She simply picked up the heavy sack of flour. She looked Martha dead in the eye, her posture straight, and offered a polite, slow nod. Thank you, Martha. She walked out. She carried her dignity like a shield. It was a quiet kind of rebellion. When Abby got back to her shop, 16-year-old Betsy was sweeping the front porch. The young orphan girl paused, leaning hard on her broom. Her face was flushed red with second-hand anger. I saw that, Betsy muttered, pointing down the street. Through the window. Why do you let her treat you like dirt, Mrs. Preston? Like you ain't even a person? Abby set the flour down on a bench. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked at the young girl. Listen to me, Betsy, Abby said. Her voice could be clear and firm in the crisp morning air. A person's worth is not decided by the whispers of a crowd. The right to hold your head high is given by God and no one else. You maintain it with clean hands and honest work. We are all born equal in the eyes of the Lord. Nobody can take your humanity away unless you choose to hand it over to them. Betsy blinked. She tightened her grip on the broom, chewing on her bottom lip as the words sank in. A heavy boot scraped against the wooden boardwalk. Spurs jingled, a slow, metallic rhythm. Abby turned. He was a tall man, broad shoulders covered in pale trail dust. He wore a faded leather duster that had seen too many winters. He was tying a roan gelding to the hitching post right in front of her shop. When he finished the knot, he turned around. His eyes met hers. The men in this town always looked away. They looked at the ground, or the sky, or their boots. But not him. He stopped. He stood to his full height. He looked at Abby, really looked at her, and there was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet, steady calm. He reached up with a leather-gloved hand and pinched the brim of his weathered Stetson. He tipped it, slow, respectful. "Morning, ma'am," he said. His voice sounded like gravel and warm earth. He treated her exactly the way a gentleman would treat a wealthy woman, standing in a Boston parlor. Like she mattered, like she was seen. Abby Seth's breath caught in her throat. For 3 years, she had been a ghost. But in the span of a single second, this stranger had just handed her back her existence. "Good morning," she whispered. He gave a curt nod, stepped off the boardwalk, and walked down the street. Abby stood there for a long time, watching his broad back disappear into the morning crowd. She didn't know his name, but her hands, which hadn't trembled in 3 years of pure hell, suddenly began to shake. The bell above the door didn't ring. It clanked, a dull, heavy sound. Abby didn't look up right away. She was feeding a length of gray cotton through the needle of her singer machine. Her foot pumped the iron treadle, a steady, mechanical heartbeat. When she finally cut the thread, she raised her eyes. It was him, the stranger from yesterday morning. He took off his hat. Dust fell from the brim, catching the morning light coming through the window. He held a pair of leather saddlebags in his left hand. The leather was thick, scored by thorns, sun-baked and stiff. A long tear ran down the right flap. He walked to the counter. He didn't drag his boots. He moved quiet, like a man used to not waking up whatever was sleeping in the brush. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Good morning." Abby folded her hands over her apron. "How can I help you?" He set the saddlebags on the counter. "Caught it on a mesquite branch. Tore clean through. Reckon it needs a heavy wax thread. Maybe a leather patch." Abby stepped closer. She ran her fingers along the tier. Her hands were rough from work, calloused. She pressed the edges of the leather together, checking the tension. "I can fix it," she said. "I'll need to skive the edges. Thin them out so the patch doesn't bulge. It'll take me until tomorrow noon. It'll cost you 50 cents. She waited for it, the haggle, the sneer. The men in this town always complained about her prices. They figured a widow with no friends ought to work for pennies. The stranger didn't blink. He reached into his vest. He pulled out a silver $50 and set it on the wood. "Tomorrow noon is fine. I'm Wyatt. Wyatt Callahan." He didn't ask her name. He already knew it. Everyone in town knew it, and they made sure any newcomer knew it before they could even unhitch their horse. But Wyatt didn't look at her like a cautionary tale. He looked at her like a tradesman, like an equal. "Abigail Preston," she said. She didn't touch the coin yet. "You pay when the work is done, Mr. Callahan." "I pay when a price is set, Mrs. Preston. Saves us both the trouble of wondering." He tapped the brim of his hat against his chest, nodded, and walked out. Abby stared at the silver coin. It sat there, heavy and shining. It wasn't just money. It was trust. It was an unspoken agreement between two human beings. Value for value, no judgments, no past, just the work. She picked up the coin. It felt warm. By mid-afternoon, the shop was stifling. Heat radiated off the tin roof. Betsy was sweeping the back room. The girl was 16, all elbows and knees, skinny as a fence post. She had no mother, no father, just a bed in the back of the livery stable until Abby had taken her in. Abby sat at her work table. She pushed the heavy steel needle through Wyatt-esque leather. Rap, pull. It took muscle. Her mind wandered. It always did when the work was repetitive. It wandered down beneath the floorboards, right under her chair. There was a loose plank there. Underneath it sat a small wooden box, locked with an iron key she wore on a string around her neck, hidden beneath the collar of her dress. Arthur S. box. Arthur Preston had been a weak man, not evil, just hollow, easily filled by the greed of others, mostly the greed of his younger brother, Silas. When the land fraud broke, when 12 families lost everything they had, Arthur took the blame. Then he took a fever. Then he took a grave. The town blamed Abby, said she hid the money, said she masterminded the whole thing. She hadn't. The truth was in that box. Ledgers. Letters. Proof that Silas was the devil behind the ink. Proof that Arthur was just a pawn. So why keep it locked? Why endure the spitting, the shoving, the silence? Because of the Collins family. Because of the Miller family. The victims. Silas had men. Violent men. If Abby brought the law down on Silas, Silas would burn out the witnesses before a judge ever made it to Dusty Creek. Abby knew it. She traded her own reputation to keep those families breathing. It was a silent cross, heavy, splintered. But she carried it, because protecting the innocent was worth more than clearing her own name. Mrs. Preston? Abby blinked. The needle slipped. A drop of bright red blood welled up on her thumb. She sucked the cut and looked up. Betsy was leaning in the doorway. She looked troubled. She held the broom like a shield. "What is it, Betsy?" "I was down at the pump, fetching water." The girl looked at the floor. Mrs. Higgins was there, and the preacher's wife. They was talking. "They usually are," they said. "I'm going to end up bad, just like you," said a woman without a man to steer her, "is bound for the ditch." Said poor folks like us ain't got the moral fortitude to stay clean. Abby stopped bleeding. She wiped her thumb on a rag. The leather saddlebag sat heavy on her lap. She looked at Betsy, really looked at her, at the frayed hem of the girl's dress, at the fear in her young, dark eyes. This was the real danger, not the mud they threw, but the lies they planted in the minds of the young. "Put the broom down, Betsy. Come here." Betsy did. She stepped close, smelling of lye soap and dust. Abby spoke soft, but her words had iron in them. "Listen to me, listen close. A person's worth is not decided by the whispers of a crowd. Do you hear me? The right to hold your head high is given by God, not by Martha Higgins, not by the preacher, and not by a bank account." Betsy stared, her breath catching. "They tell you a woman needs a man to steer her. That's a lie born of their own fear," Abby continued, her voice rhythmic, steady. "A woman needs a compass, just like a man. You find that compass in the truth. You maintain your dignity with clean hands and honest work. We are all born equal in the eyes of the Lord. Nobody can take your humanity away, Betsy, nobody, unless you choose to hand it over to them." Betsy stood very still. The fear in her eyes was melting. Replacing it was something harder, something brighter. "But why do they say it?" "Then," Betsy whispered, "if it ain't true. Because if they keep you feeling small, they get to feel big. It's an old trick. Don't fall for it." Abby picked up her needle. She pushed it through the thick leather. "Pull. Wrap. Pull. Now, go fetch that water, and walk right through the middle of the street when you do." Betsy nodded. She grabbed the bucket. Her shoulders were pulled back. Her chin was up. Abby watched her go. Then she looked down at Wyatt Callahan S. saddlebag. The stitches were perfectly straight, strong, binding two broken pieces together. She kept sewing. A week passed. The heat didn't break. Wyatt Callahan came back to the shop. He didn't need saddlebags fixed this time. It was a canvas coat, torn at the elbow. 2 days later, it was a leather bridle, snapped at the cheek piece. He didn't linger. He didn't make small talk. He brought the work. He paid the price. He tipped his hat. But he was noticing things. Wyatt was a man who survived by watching. He saw the way the town moved around Abby, like she was diseased. He saw the grocer ignore her until everyone else was served. He saw the blacksmith spit in the dirt when she walked past the forge. He saw it all, and it sat wrong in his gut. Wyatt knew what it meant to be cast out. He knew the taste of betrayal. Years ago, his best friend, his brother in every way, but blood had left him bleeding in the dirt. Took their cattle, took their money, took the woman Wyatt thought he was going to marry. That kind of betrayal teaches a man a hard lesson. It teaches you that a smiling face can hide a rotten soul. And it teaches you that a silent, shunned person might just be the only honest soul left in a 50-mile radius. It was Tuesday morning. The air was thick, heavy with the promise of a thunderstorm that refused to break. Abby was sweeping her front porch. The wood was clean, whitewashed. She took pride in it. It was her small piece of the world, and she kept it orderly. Down the street, the church women were walking. A pack of them, led by Martha Higgins. They carried parasols to block the sun. They wore stiff collars and tight corsets. They looked like walking fortresses of morality. Wyatt was sitting on a barrel outside the deed store, across the street. He was whittling a piece of pine, just watching. The women walked past Abby's shop. The street was deeply rutted from freight wagons. Last night, someone had left a trough running. A large, foul puddle of muddy water sat directly in front of Abby's porch, mixing with horse dung and dust. Martha Higgins didn't slow down. She didn't look at Abby. But as she passed the puddle, she stepped hard on the edge of a loose board, laying in the mud. Splatter. A thick wave of dark, foul mud flew up. It hit the whitewashed posts of Abby's porch. It splashed across the clean floorboards. A few drops hit the hem of Abby's gray cotton dress. The women didn't stop. A few of them giggled. Martha Higgins kept her nose in the air, her parasol twirling. Abby stopped sweeping. She looked at the mud on her porch. She looked at her dress. Wyatt's hand stopped moving. His knife dug deep into the pine wood and stayed there. He expected Abby to yell. He expected her to throw the broom. He expected tears. She did none of those things. She leaned the broom against the wall. She turned around. She walked inside the shop. A moment later, she came back out with a wooden bucket of clean water and a stiff bristle brush. She was going to get on her knees. She was going to scrub the mud they threw at her. Without a single word, Wyatt closed his pocket knife. He slid it into his pocket. He stood up. His boots hit the boardwalk. Heavy, deliberate. He crossed the street. The jingle of his spurs cut through the quiet morning. People stopped what they were doing. The blacksmith paused his hammer. The barber stepped to his window. Even Martha Higgins and her flock stopped and turned. Wyatt stepped onto Abby's porch. Abby was just bending down, the brush in her hand. Wyatt reached out. He took the bucket from her left hand. He took the brush from her right. He didn't ask. He just took them. "Mr. Callahan?" Abby said, her voice a startled whisper. Wyatt didn't answer. He rolled up the sleeves of his faded shirt. He knelt down on the hard wood, a grown man, a cowboy, getting on his knees on a porch. He dipped the brush into the water. He applied it to the muddy wood. Scrub, scrub, scrub. He scrubbed the wood until it was white again. He rinsed the brush. He moved to the post. He scrubbed that too. The silence in the street was absolute. You could hear a pin drop in the dust. A man doing women's work. A man cleaning up a mess meant to degrade a pariah. It was a physical rejection of everything the town had agreed upon. Martha Higgins' face turned the color of a bruised plum. She marched back toward the porch, her parasol snapping shut like a rifle bolt. "Excuse me, mister," Martha snapped. "What do you think you're doing?" Wyatt finished scrubbing the post. He dropped the brush into the bucket. He stood up. Slowly, he unrolled his sleeves. He turned to face the women. He towered over them, but his voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was cold, hard as anvil steel. "I'm cleaning up a mess, ma'am," Wyatt said. "That woman," Martha pointed a trembling, gloved finger at Abby, "is a blight on this town. She is a thief and a liar. You are making a fool of yourself defending her." Wyatt stepped forward, just one step, but it made the women shrink back. "A fool?" Wyatt tilted his head. "I'll tell you what's foolish. A town full of God-fearing folks who spend their mornings throwing mud at a widow. You don't know the things she's done," a woman in the back yelled. "I don't care what you think she's done," Wyatt fired back. His voice finally rose, carrying across the dusty street, bouncing off the wooden storefronts. "Unfair judgment is a poison. It kills a community faster than a cholera plague. Every citizen in this country, man or woman, rich or poor, has the right to be treated with basic human decency, until a judge with a gavel proves otherwise." He looked directly at Martha. "You want to call yourselves Christians? Then act like it. But you throw mud on this porch again, and you'll find out I don't turn the other cheek." He held Martha's gaze. He didn't blink. He didn't waver. Martha S. mouth opened, but nothing came out. The sheer weight of his conviction crushed her self-righteousness. She spun around, her skirts kicking up dust, and marched away. The rest of the flock scattered like frightened quail. Wyatt stood there for a moment, watching them go. Then he picked up the bucket. He turned to Abby. She was staring at him. Her chest was rising and falling fast. Her eyes were wide, shining with something she was trying very hard to hold back. Nobody had defended her. Not in 3 long, brutal years. "Water's dirty," Wyatt said, his voice dropping back to that low, steady rumble. "I'll go empty it out back." He walked around the side of the shop. Abby closed her eyes. She leaned back against the doorframe. The wood felt solid behind her. For the first time since Arthur died, Abigail Preston didn't feel entirely alone in the world. The rain started a little past midnight. It didn't fall so much as it drove sideways, hammering the tin roof of Wyatt Callahan's cabin like a handful of dropped nails. Wyatt couldn't sleep. His left shoulder ached. It always did when the barometer dropped. A deep, dull throb right where the bone had been chipped away by a .44 caliber slug. He gave up on the bed around 2 in the morning. He struck a sulfur match against the iron stove. The flame flared, casting long, jumping shadows across the rough-hewn walls of the old Hicks place. He lit a kerosene lantern and turned the wick down low. He needed something to do with his hands. He went to the corner of the room. He popped the brass latches on an old leather trunk. It was the trunk he had carried with him for 6 years. The one that held the few things Jedediah Preston hadn't managed to steal. Wyatt dug through the bottom, past the spare horse blankets, past the box of Winchester shells. His hand brushed against something rough, heavy canvas. He pulled it out. It was his old trail coat. The coat was ruined, stained with grease, alkali dust, and a large, dark rust-colored patch on the left shoulder. Old blood, his blood. Wyatt ran his thumb over the fabric, right over the bullet hole. The hole wasn't open. It was patched. A square of thick canvas had been set over the torn edges and sewn tight. Wyatt brought the coat closer to the lantern light. He stared at the stitches. He had looked at them 100 times over the years, but he had never really seen them. Not until he had watched Abigail Preston sew a torn saddlebag 2 days ago. The thread on the coat was a dark green heavy-duty, but it was the color that made Wyatt's chest go tight. It was the angle. Every stitch was set at a perfect 45-degree slant, spaced exactly 1/8 of an inch apart. It was a lock stitch, done by hand, but with the ruthless precision of a machine. The tension was flawless. It was the exact same stitch that held his leather saddlebag together down at the seamstress shop. Wyatt sank onto a wooden chair. The floorboards creaked. The memory hit him. Cold and sharp. Winter. 1872. A blizzard outside of Abilene. He was bleeding out in the saddle. Jedediah had shot him in the back, taken the herd, and ridden off with the woman Wyatt had bought a ring for. Wyatt's horse had carried him until it could walk anymore. He had fallen into the snow. He saw a single yellow light through the timber, a cabin. He knocked. He collapsed. The door opened. He remembered the smell of lye soap and lavender. He remembered soft, capable hands pulling away his frozen, blood-soaked coat. She didn't scream. She didn't ask if the men who shot him were coming. She just dragged him to the fire, poured boiling water over his wound, packed it with yarrow, bound it tight. He had drifted in and out of a fever dream, but he remembered waking up in the dark, hours later. The woman was sitting by the hearth. Her face was hidden in the shadows. She was holding his ruined coat, sewing a patch over the bullet hole so he wouldn't freeze to death on the trail. Wyatt had left an hour before dawn. He was terrified Jedediah. S-men were tracking him. He didn't want to bring death to the doorstep of the only kind soul he had met in a month. He left a silver dollar on the table and slipped out into the snow. He never saw her face. He never learned her name. Wyatt stared at the green thread in the lantern light. It was her, Abigail Preston, the woman this entire town treated like a stray dog with the mange. She was the one who had kept him breathing. She had saved his life, no questions asked, and let him ride away without a word of thanks. Wyatt closed his eyes. He let out a long, shaky breath. When the sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the Texas plains a bruised orange, Wyatt was already saddled. He didn't ride his horse. He hitched up the freight wagon. He drove straight into Dusty Creek. The town was just waking up. Folks were sweeping their boardwalks. The Mercantile was opening its doors. Martha Higgins was out front, arranging a display of tin-canned goods. Wyatt drove the wagon right past her. He didn't look at her. He pulled up in front of the lumber yard. He bought 10 thick planks of premium, cured cedar. He paid in cash. He loaded them into the back of the wagon. Then he walked over to the dry goods store. He bought 3 massive, heavy bolts of wool fabric, the expensive kind, keg of nails. He bought a new iron stovepipe. He loaded it all up. The wagon groaned under the weight. Wyatt snapped the reins. He drove the heavy wagon straight down the center of Main Street, broad daylight. The sun was high and bright. He pulled the wagon right up to the front of Abigail Preston S. Seamstress shop. Abby was inside. She heard the horses. She stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked at the wagon, then she looked at Wyatt. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "are you building a house?" "No, ma'am," Wyatt said. He climbed down from the wagon box. "I noticed the floorboards on your back porch are rotting out, and you mentioned last week you were running low on winter wool. I had to save you the freight charge." Abby just stared. "I didn't order these." "I know." Wyatt didn't wait for permission. He unlatched the wagon tailgate. He hoisted a heavy bolt of wool onto his shoulder. Across the street, people were stopping. The blacksmith leaned on his hammer. Martha Higgins stood perfectly still, a tin of peaches in her hand. Everyone was watching. Wyatt ignored them all. He carried the wool up the steps. He treated the shop like it was a palace. He treated Abby like she was the queen of it. "Where do you want this, Mrs. Preston?" he asked gently. "In the back room," she whispered. Her voice was trembling. Wyatt nodded. He carried it in. He went back out to the wagon. He picked up another bolt, then the keg of nails. He spent the next 2 hours unloading the wagon right in front of the entire town. He didn't say a word to the folks watching. He didn't have to. Every heavy footstep, every swing of his broad shoulders carried a message louder than a church bell. This woman is under my protection. This woman has value. You want to pretend she doesn't exist? Watch me serve her. When the wagon was empty, Wyatt stood on the porch. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a bandana. Abby came to the door. She held a tin cup of cold water. Her hand was shaking so badly the water rippled. "Wyatt," she said. She dropped the formalities. "Why are you doing this? They turn on you. They treat you just like me." Wyatt took the cup. His fingers brushed against hers. Her skin was cold. "Let them try," he said softly. He drank the water. He didn't tell her about the canvas coat. Not yet. He knew she carried secrets to protect others. He figured she wouldn't want her own secret dragged out into the light just yet. He handed the cup back. He looked down the street. Martha Higgins had gone inside and slammed her door. "I'll be by tomorrow to fix that back porch," Wyatt said. He tipped his hat. "Have a good afternoon, Abby." He climbed onto the wagon. He drove away. Abby stood on the porch. The sun felt warm on her face. For the first time in years, she didn't look down at her boots. She looked straight ahead. Wyatt didn't like mysteries. He liked fences. Fences made sense. You knew where the boundary was, and you knew what was meant to stay out. The hatred Martha Higgins had for Abby wasn't a fence. It was a wildfire. It jumped logic. It burned too hot to just be about a dead husband and a land fraud. People hated thieves, sure. But the way Martha looked at Abby, that was terror. Wyatt needed to know why. He walked into the Dusty Creek Saloon on a Thursday evening. It was quiet. A few ranch hands playing faro in the corner. The bartender was polishing glasses. An old man named Doc Miller was sitting at a table near the window, nursing a warm beer. Doc had been the town physician, until his hand started shaking too bad to hold a scalpel. Wyatt bought a bottle of rye and 2 glasses. He walked over to Doc's table and set them down. Doc looked up. His eyes were milky, but sharp. "I ain't got money to pay for that, cowboy." "Good thing I ain't selling it," Wyatt said. He sat down. He poured 2 fingers of rye into each glass. They drank in silence for a minute. The rye burned. It felt good. "You've been in this town a long time, Doc," Wyatt said. "Since before there was a town," Doc rasped. "Since it was just a watering hole and a trading post. Tell me about the winter of '74. Doc's hand stopped halfway to his mouth. He set the glass down. "That was a bad winter. Hard freeze. Lost a lot of cattle. I'm not asking about cattle. I'm asking about Abigail Preston and Martha Higgins." Doc sighed. He looked out the window. The street was dark. "Folks here think Abby is rotten because of what Arthur did," Doc said, his voice low. "But the rot started before that. Started with Martha." "Why?" "Martha had a daughter, Emily. Pretty girl. Wild as a Mustang. Winter of '74, Emily went missing for 3 days right in the middle of a blizzard. Martha told everyone the girl was bedridden with influenza. Nobody was allowed to visit." Doc dragged a finger through the condensation on his glass. "But I was the doctor. I knew better. The girl wasn't in that house." Wyatt leaned forward. "Where was she?" "I don't know for a fact," Doc said. "But 3 days later, I saw Emily walking out of Abby Preston-esque back door. The girl looked like a ghost, pale, bleeding." 2 days after that, Martha sent Emily on a stagecoach back east to live with an aunt. Claimed it was for her health. Wyatt stared at the wall. The pieces clicked together in his mind with a sickening snap. A wild teenage girl. A sudden disappearance. A discreet visit to the town as most quiet, isolated seamstress. A hurried trip out of town. Emily had gotten pregnant. She had miscarried, or maybe the pregnancy had gone wrong. And Abby quiet, capable Abby had taken the girl in. She had nursed her through the blood and the pain. Kept her safe. Kept her secret. And how had Martha repaid her? Martha was the pillar of the church. If the town found out her daughter had a child out of wedlock, her social standing would burn to ash. Martha knew Abby held the matches, so Martha struck first. She began the whispers. She isolated Abby. When Arthur S. fraud happened a year later, Martha threw fuel on the fire, ensuring Abby was completely exiled. If Abby ever tried to tell the truth about Emily, no one in Dusty Creek would believe the word of a pariah over the word of the pious Martha Higgins. It was a preemptive strike, born of absolute cowardly fear. Wyatt felt a cold rage knot in his stomach. He thanked Doc, left the bottle on the table, and walked out into the night. The next afternoon, Wyatt was in a back room of Abby S.'s shop. He had his shirt sleeves rolled up, replacing the rotted floorboards, just like he promised. The rhythmic thwack of his hammer echoed through the small building. In the front room, the shop door opened. Wyatt paused his hammer. He heard voices. It was Betsy. The girl was crying, not loud, but thick, heavy sobs. Betsy? Abby's voice was gentle, the sound of a chair scraping across the floor. Child, what happened? I was down at the mercantile, Betsy choked out. I was just looking at the ribbon. Mrs. Higgins? She came over. She told me I had no business looking at pretty things. Said girls with no fathers and no money only end up on their backs. Said I was already ruined just by living under your roof. Silence hung in the shop, heavy and dark. Wyatt gripped the handle of his hammer. His knuckles went white. He wanted to march down to that store. He wanted to tear the sign off the front of Martha Higgins' building. But he didn't move. He listened. He heard Abby walk across the room. He heard the rustle of cotton. She was kneeling down in front of the girl. Look at me, Betsy, Abby said. The crying slowed to a sniffle. Martha Higgins is a cruel woman, Abby said. Her voice wasn't angry. It was deeply, profoundly sad. But do you know where cruelty comes from? From the devil, Betsy whispered. No, Abby said firmly. It comes from fear. Martha Higgins is terrified. She lives every day of her life terrified that the world will find out she isn't perfect. She attacks you, and she attacks me, because it makes her feel safe. She hates you, Betsy said. She hates what I represent. Abby corrected. Wyatt leaned closer to the open doorway. He stayed out of sight. Listen to me, Betsy, because this is the most important thing you will ever learn, Abby said. The rhythm of her voice was like a steady drumbeat, unshakable. Women in this world have a hard enough road to walk. We are given little power and less grace. True compassion, real strength, is helping another woman in her darkest hour, even when she has nothing to offer you, even if she turns around and bites the hand that fed her. But she hurts you, Betsy cried. Why don't you fight back? Tell people what she is. Because I refuse to use another woman's pain as a weapon, Abby stated cleanly. If I tear Martha down, I have to expose the pain of someone else who didn't deserve it. And I won't do that. You never use a sister's tragedy to build your own armor. Ever. Even if it costs you your own reputation. Betsy was quiet. You want to beat Martha Higgins? Abby asked softly. You don't do it by throwing mud back. You beat her by refusing to believe the lies she tells you about your own worth. You are a good girl. You work hard. You are valuable. When she looks at you, she sees a target. I want you to look right back at her and let her see a wall of solid stone. Wyatt stood in the back room. The hammer in his hand felt light, meaningless. He had spent his whole life thinking strength was a quick draw, thinking justice was a heavy fist or a loaded Colt. He was wrong. He was standing 20 feet away from the strongest human being he had ever known in his life. Abigail Preston was a fortress. The town had spent 3 years firing cannons at her walls, and they hadn't even cracked the mortar. Wyatt quietly set the hammer down. He stepped into the doorway. Abby was wiping a tear from Betsy's cheek with her thumb. She looked up and saw Wyatt standing there. She expected him to turn away, to pretend he hadn't heard women's business. Wyatt didn't turn away. He looked at Abby. He took off his hat, and he held it over his chest. It was a salute, from a soldier in the dirt to the general standing on the hill. Abby's breath hitched. A faint, dusty pink rose to her cheeks. She nodded back to him. Wyatt turned around, picked up his hammer, and went back to work, fixing her floor, building the foundation back up, one board at a time. Sunday morning in Dusty Creek always had a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the tired quiet of a Tuesday night, nor the tense, breathless quiet before a storm. It was a scrubbed, clean quiet, the kind of quiet that came when folks put on their stiff collars, slicked their hair down with pomade, and pretended, for 2 hours, that they didn't hate their neighbors. Abby Preston didn't pretend. She sat at the edge of her bed. She buttoned her high-collared black dress. Her fingers were nimble from the needlework, but they moved slow today. Sunday was the hardest day of the week. "You don't have to go, Mrs. Preston," Betsy said. The girl was standing in the doorway. She was wearing the new cotton dress Abby had sewn for her. Light blue. It made her look younger, less bruised by the world. "Yes, Betsy, I do." "Why?" Betsy crossed her arms. "They don't want you there. They preach about loving thy neighbor, and then they look at you like you tracked horse muck onto their parlor rug. It ain't right." Abby stood up. She walked over to the washstand. She pinned her hair back, tight, no loose strands. "It isn't about what they want, Betsy," Abby said. Her voice was calm, measured. "A church doesn't belong to Martha Higgins. It doesn't belong to the Reverend. It belongs to God." Betsy frowned. "Doesn't feel like God is in that building much." Abby turned to the girl. She put a hand on Betsy's shoulder. "Listen to me. If I stop going, I am agreeing with them. I am telling them that their judgment is the final word on my soul." Abby looked deep into the girl's eyes. "You never forfeit your space in the world just because someone else is uncomfortable with you occupying it. Taking up space when the world tells you to disappear is the purest form of survival." Betsy chewed her lip. She gave a small nod. "Go on now," Abby said, handing the girl a worn Bible. "You sit up front with the other children. Do not look back at me. You look straight ahead." They walked to the church. The building was white clapboard. It sat at the end of Main Street. The bell in the steeple was ringing, a heavy iron toll. Folks were milling about on the front lawn, men in wool suits smoking hand-rolled cigarettes, women twirling parasols, gossiping in low tones. When Abby unlatched the front gate, the voices stopped. It was like turning off a lantern in a dark room. Instant, total. The crowd parted. They didn't move aggressively. They just drifted away from her, creating a wide, invisible circle, like she carried the yellow fever. Abby kept her chin level. She walked up the wooden steps. She walked through the heavy double doors. The inside of the church smelled like pine polish and stale sweat. It was hot. Women were already fanning themselves with folded paper fans. Abby walked down the center aisle. The pews were filling up, but the back left corner was empty. It was always empty. Abby sat down in the very last row. She placed her Bible in her lap. She folded her hands over it. 5 minutes passed. The church filled to the brim. Families squeezed together in the front and middle rows. People stood in the back right corner. But no one sat next to Abby. Physical void separated her from the rest of the congregation. 3 empty seats to her right. The entire pew in front of her. Empty. It was a silent, violent act of exclusion. They were drawing a line in the sand right inside the house of God. We are the righteous. She is the damned. Abby stared at the wooden cross on the far wall. She didn't let her shoulders drop. She didn't let her eyes water. Then, the heavy double doors opened again. The bell had already stopped ringing. The Reverend was just stepping up to the pulpit. The congregation turned to see who was late. It was Wyatt Callahan. He didn't wear a wool suit. He wore clean denim, a fresh white cotton shirt. His boots were polished. He held his Stetson in his hands. He stepped into the church. He looked massive. The doorway seemed to shrink around his shoulders. The Reverend cleared his throat. "Welcome, brother. There is room down front. The Miller family can slide over." Wyatt didn't look at the Reverend. His eyes swept over the congregation. He saw the squeezed families. He saw the men standing by the door. And then he saw the back left corner. He saw Abigail Preston sitting on an island of polished pine, surrounded by an ocean of empty space. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He didn't walk to the front. He didn't stand by the wall. He walked straight down the aisle. His boots echoed on the hardwood floor. Slow, deliberate. The jingle of his spurs had been muffled, but the heavy thud of his heels commanded the room. He reached the last row. He turned into Abby's pew. He walked past the 3 empty seats. He didn't leave a buffer. He didn't leave a polite distance. He sat down right next to her, shoulder to shoulder. The silence in the church was deafening. You could hear the timber of the roof groaning under the Texas sun. Someone in the second row gasped. Martha Higgins dropped her paper fan. It hit the floor with a loud clack. Wyatt crossed his arms. He looked straight ahead at the pulpit, completely unbothered. Abby's heart was beating so hard, she felt it in her teeth. She looked at him out of the corner of her eye. His jaw was set. His arm was a warm, solid wall against hers. He hadn't thrown a punch. He hadn't drawn a gun. But by simply choosing that empty chair, Wyatt Callahan had just declared war on the entire town of Dusty Creek. He had taken their most powerful weapon, isolation, and broken it over his knee. He was telling them, without a single word, "She is human, she is equal, and I am with her." The Reverend swallowed hard. He opened his Bible. His hands were shaking slightly. "Turn to the book of Matthew," the Reverend stammered. The sermon was a disaster. The Reverend couldn't find his rhythm. He preached about weeds in the garden, about pulling up the rot so the crop could survive. It was a cowardly sermon. A thinly veiled justification for how the town treated the woman sitting in the back row. Wyatt sat through it like a stone statue. He didn't nod. He didn't say amen. He just stared the Reverend down. When the final hymn was sung, the congregation hurried to the doors. They wanted out of that room. The tension was too thick to breathe. Abby stood up. Wyatt stood up with her. He stepped out of the pew, allowing her to pass. "You didn't have to do that," Abby whispered, keeping her eyes forward as they walked down the aisle. "I wanted a good seat," Wyatt replied. His voice was low. "Easy." They stepped out into the blinding midday sun. The crowd hadn't dispersed. They were lingering on the lawn, watching, waiting to see what would happen. The Reverend was standing at the bottom of the steps. He was sweating heavily. He held a Bible tight against his chest. As Wyatt and Abby descended the stairs, the Reverend stepped into their path. "Mr. Callahan," the Reverend said. His voice was tight, strained. Wyatt stopped. He put his hat on, adjusting the brim to shade his eyes. "Reverend, could I have a word with you? In private. Whatever you have to say to me, you can say it here," Wyatt said. He didn't move away from Abby. "I don't hold much stock in private whispers." The Reverend glanced nervously at the surrounding crowd. Martha Higgins was standing near the gate, leaning forward to hear. "Mr. Callahan," the Reverend lowered his voice, trying to force intimacy. "You are new to our flock. You don't understand the history of this town. We strive for peace here. We strive for moral order. Your actions today, sitting where you sat, it is highly disruptive. It upsets the congregation." Wyatt looked at the Reverend. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly disappointed. "Disruptive." Wyatt repeated the word slowly, rolling it around. "Yes?" The Reverend pressed, gaining a fraction of confidence. "We must protect the flock from bad influences. It is my duty to keep the wolves away from the sheep." Wyatt shifted his weight. He looked around the lawn. He made sure every man and woman standing there was listening. When he spoke, his voice rang out like a hammer striking an anvil. Clear, unapologetic. "The good book teaches us to love our neighbors, Reverend. But looking around this lawn, I see a town that only loves the folks who look, act, and think exactly like them. That ain't faith. That's just a club." The Reverend went pale. "Now see here." "No, you see here." Wyatt cut him off. His voice didn't rise, but it grew infinitely heavier. "A healthy community cannot be built on the broken back of a defenseless woman. You talk about moral order. Where is the morality in a dozen men and women freezing out a widow? Where is the God in starving a woman out of town? Because you're too cowardly to look at your own sins." Martha Higgins gasped loudly from the gate. Wyatt pointed a thick, calloused finger at the Reverend's chest. "You call yourselves sheep, but sheep don't gang up to crush one of their own. You want to talk about wolves? The only wolves I see in Dusty Creek are the ones hiding behind the cross, using the Lord's name to justify their own petty cruelty." Total silence fell over the churchyard. Wyatt had stripped the bark right off the tree. He had named the thing they were all doing, and he had laid it bare in the daylight. "Equality isn't a suggestion, Reverend," Wyatt stated, locking eyes with the preacher. "It's a mandate. You strip a person of their dignity, you strip yourself of your own humanity. You'd do well to preach on that next Sunday." Wyatt turned away from the Reverend. He looked at Abby. He offered her his arm. It was an old-fashioned gesture, a gentleman's gesture. Abby looked at his arm. She looked at the crowd, staring at them in stunned silence. She felt a tear hot against her lower lash line. She blinked it away. She reached out. She placed her gloved hand on the crook of Wyatt Callahan's elbow. They walked through the churchyard gate. The crowd parted for them again. But this time, it wasn't out of disgust. It was out of shock, out of awe. They walked down the center of Main Street. The heat was radiating off the dust. The town was quiet. "They'll come after you now," Abby said softly. Her hand gripped his arm tighter. "Martha, the Reverend. They'll poison your name. They'll stop buying your cattle. Let them," Wyatt said. Why, Wyatt? Why take my burden?" Wyatt slowed his pace. He looked down at her. The brim of his hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but she could see the truth in them. Hard, unyielding. Because a man who stands by and watches a lynching without throwing a punch is just as guilty as the man holding the rope. Wyatt said, "Your burden was never yours to carry alone, Abby. The town just convinced you it was." He looked forward again. "Besides," he added, a faint dry smile touching the corner of his mouth, "I never much cared for crowds anyway. I prefer the empty chairs." They kept walking, past the mercantile, past the saloon, toward the small seamstress shop at the edge of town. For the first time in 3 years, the walk didn't feel so long. Dusty Creek was a town of locked doors and drawn curtains. Folks here minded their own business, right up until they decided yours was more interesting. Wyatt Callahan knew how to read a town. He knew how to read men, too. You learn a lot about a man by the way he wears his iron. A braggart wears his pistol low and tied down, ready to draw. An honest lawman wears it high on the hip, out of the way, but there if the devil calls. Sheriff Samuel Becker wore his gun high, but he walked like a man, carrying an anvil on his back. Samuel wasn't a bad man. Wyatt had watched him for a week. The sheriff broke up saloon fights without throwing a punch. He helped old Mrs. Gable hitch her wagon. He didn't strut, he didn't shout, but his eyes were hollow, gray, like ash left in a cold stove. Wyatt knew that look. It was the look of a man drowning in dry dirt. It was a Tuesday night. No moon. The wind was howling down off the plains, kicking up dust that stung the eyes. Wyatt was sitting on a barrel in the dark alley beside the livery stable. He had his hat pulled low. He was smoking a hand-rolled cigarette. He was waiting. Just past midnight, he heard the sound of hooves, slow, muffled. A rider came down the back alley. He wore a dark canvas slicker. He pulled his horse up behind the jailhouse. Wyatt pinched out his cigarette. He slipped into the deeper shadows. He moved without a sound. The back door of the jailhouse opened. Sheriff Samuel Becker stepped out. He held a lantern. The wick turned down so low it barely cast a glow. The rider didn't dismount. He reached into his saddlebag. He pulled out a heavy leather pouch. It clinked. Coins, heavy silver or gold. The rider tossed the pouch. Samuel caught it. "His president says that that's the last of it for the month," the rider said. His voice was rough. "Says you better keep that stray dog Callahan from digging up the pasture. He's making too much noise." Samuel gripped the pouch. His knuckles were white. "I'm the law here, not Silas Preston. You tell him I'll handle my town." "You handle it, Sheriff," the rider sneered, "or Mr. Preston will cut off the funds. And we both know your missus won't last the winter without her syrup." Samuel S.'s shoulders dropped. The fight left him all at once. The rider turned his horse and rode out into the dark. Wyatt stood perfectly still in the shadows. His jaw was clenched so tight, his teeth ached. Silas Preston, Arthur S.'s younger brother. The man who had actually stolen the land money. The man Abby was taking the blame for. Silas was paying the law to look the other way. It made sense. It made ugly, brutal sense. But Wyatt didn't draw his gun. He didn't step out of the shadows and arrest the sheriff. He watched. Samuel turned around. He leaned his forehead against the rough timber of the jailhouse door. He stood there for a long time. His shoulders heaved. He was a man breaking in half. Finally, Samuel went inside. Wyatt didn't follow him. Not yet. He needed the whole picture. The next morning, Wyatt rode 10 miles to the neighboring town of Red River. He walked into the apothecary. "I need laudanum," Wyatt told the clerk, "the pure stuff. And whatever else you got for deep lung pain. Consumption." The clerk adjusted his spectacles. He looked at Wyatt's dusty clothes. "That's expensive medicine, cowboy. A bottle of the good syrup is $5. The morphine powders are 10. Not many folks can afford it. Sheriff Becker over in Dusty Creek is the only one buys it regular." "I can afford it," Wyatt said. He laid a $20 gold piece on the glass counter. The clerk fetched 2 dark amber bottles and a small paper-wrapped box. Wyatt put them in his saddlebag. He rode back to Dusty Creek. The sun was setting by the time he hitched his roan outside the jailhouse. The town was quiet. Folks were eating dinner. Wyatt unbuckled his gun belt. He wrapped the leather strap around the holster and hung it on the saddle horn. He wasn't going in as a gunslinger. He was going in as a man. He pushed the door of the jailhouse open. Sheriff Samuel Becker was sitting at his desk. The oil lamp was lit. A pile of wanted posters sat unread in front of him. He looked up. When he saw Wyatt, his hand instinctively drifted toward the Colt on his hip. "Evening, Samuel," Wyatt said. He didn't raise his hands. He just stood in the doorway. "Callahan." Samuel S.'s voice was tight. "You looking for trouble?" "No. I am looking for the law." Wyatt walked into the room. He reached into his canvas coat. Samuel tensed. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Wyatt slowly pulled out the 2 amber bottles and the small box. He set them gently on the scarred wooden desk, right next to the sheriff's tin coffee cup. Samuel looked at the bottles. The blood drained from his face. He looked back up at Wyatt. His eyes were wide, terrified. "I was in Red River today," Wyatt said. His voice was low, steady, the rhythm of a man stating plain facts. "Talk to the apothecary. He says this is the best there is for a dying pair of lungs." Samuel stared at the medicine. His hand fell away from his gun. "How long has Sarah been sick?" Wyatt asked. Samuel swallowed. His throat clicked. 2 years. It started as a cough. Then the blood came. The pain, God, the pain she's in. It tears her apart. The only thing that lets her sleep is the syrup. And a deputy's salary doesn't cover $5 a bottle, Wyatt said. "No." Samuel looked down at his hands. "It don't." Wyatt pulled up a wooden chair. He sat down across from the sheriff. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He just let the silence sit between them for a moment. Action and restraint. That was the lesson Wyatt was laying down. He was a man capable of violence, choosing mercy. He was showing Samuel that holding power didn't mean you had to crush the weak. It meant you had the choice to lift them up. "Silas Preston came to me right after Arthur died," Samuel whispered. The confession spilled out of him like water from a cracked jug. "I found the ledgers. I knew Silas engineered the fraud. Arthur was just a fool who signed the papers. But Silas had money. He saw Sarah coughing. He offered to pay for her medicine. All of it. As long as I let the town believe Abby was the mastermind. As long as I kept the law off his back." "And you took it," Wyatt said. "I love my wife, Callahan." Samuel looked up. His eyes were shining with tears. "I would burn this whole town to the ground to keep her breathing for one more day. You judge me all you want. You don't know what it's like to watch the person you love suffer." "I know exactly what it's like," Wyatt said softly. Samuel blinked. Wyatt leaned forward. He rested forearms on his knees. "I'm not judging your love for your wife, Samuel. A man ought to do whatever he can to protect his family." Wyatt's voice grew firmer. The gravel in it hardened. "But corruption born of love is still corruption. You don't protect your family by destroying someone else's." Samuel flinched. "Look out that window," Wyatt pointed to the glass, "down at the end of the street. There is a woman sitting in a quiet shop. She has been spit on. She has been starved. She has been treated like dirt under the boots of this town for 3 years. She is innocent. And she is paying for your wife's medicine with her life." "I never told them to treat Abby that way," Samuel argued, desperate. "You didn't have to," Wyatt fired back. His words were sharp now, precise, cutting through the sheriff's excuses. "Silence is the heaviest stone you can throw at an innocent person. When the man wearing the tin star stays quiet, he gives the mob permission to hang the rope. Your silence built her prison." Samuel put his face in his hands. A dry, ragged sob shook his shoulders. Wyatt sat back. He let the man cry. This was the hard part of truth. It didn't care about your reasons. It only cared about the balance of the scales. Justice isn't a luxury you afford when times are easy, Samuel, Wyatt said. His tone shifted from stern to educational. He was speaking as a man who had learned this lesson the hard way. Justice is the floorboards you stand on when the house is burning down. If you trade your honor to save a life, the life you save is built on rot. It won't hold. Samuel wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. If I arrest Silas, he stops the money. Sarah dies in agony. That medicine on the desk, Wyatt pointed to the amber bottles. That's a 2-month supply, paid in full, my coin. Samuel stared at him, shocked. Why? Why would you do that for me? I didn't do it for you, Wyatt said. I did it for Sarah, and I did it for Abby. Wyatt stood up. He pushed the chair in. You are not a bad man, Samuel, but you are a weak one. You let fear dictate your morals. Wyatt looked down at the badge pinned to Samuel's chest. A badge is a promise. It's a promise to the weak that the strong won't eat them. You broke that promise, but you can fix it. Wyatt reached into his pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. He set it on the desk next to the medicine. It was a blank sheet. I'm not going to draw my gun on you, Wyatt said. I'm not going to drag you out into the street. A forced confession isn't justice. It's just theater. Samuel looked at the paper. What is this? That's a choice, Wyatt said. You have 2 months of medicine. Silas has no hold on you anymore. So tomorrow morning, you sit at this desk. You write down everything you know about Silas Preston. You sign it, and you wire the U.S. Marshal in Austin. Samuel's hands were shaking. Silas will kill me. He has men. Let him try, Wyatt said flatly. He has to get through me first. Wyatt turned and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the iron latch. You have a choice to make, Sheriff. You can wear the badge, or you can take the bribe. But you can't wear both. Not anymore. I'll be back tomorrow at noon. If that paper isn't signed, I'm riding to Austin myself, and I won't be bringing medicine when I come back. Wyatt opened the door. The cool night air rushed into the stuffy room. He stepped out into the dark. He left the door open. Samuel Becker sat alone at his desk. He looked at the tin star on his chest. Then he looked at the medicine. Finally, he reached out and touched the blank piece of paper. For the first time in 3 years, the sheriff of Dusty Creek picked up his pen. Nighttime in Texas didn't bring relief. It just brought a different kind of heavy. The heat baked into the hard-pan dirt all day, slowly seeped back up through the floorboards. It smelled like dry sage and old wood. Wyatt was sitting in the back room of Abby's shop. The shades were pulled down tight. The oil lamp on the small kitchen table cast a warm, golden circle over the scarred wood. Wyatt was making coffee. He didn't ask Abby to do it. He didn't sit in a chair and wait to be served. He walked over to her cast-iron stove, stoked the embers, and boiled the water himself. He measured the grounds. He poured 2 cups. He set one down in front of her. Abby watched him. Her hands were folded in her lap. It was a small thing, a man pouring coffee for a woman. But in Dusty Creek, it was a revolution. Men here believed a woman's worth was tied to how well she served them. Wyatt believed a person's worth was proven by how well they served each other. He pulled out a chair. He sat down across from her. The shop was quiet. The town outside was holding its breath. Ever since Wyatt had sat beside her in church, the air in Dusty Creek felt like a stretched wire. Ready to snap, Wyatt took a sip of his coffee. Black, bitter, just right. Sheriff Becker is writing a letter, Wyatt said. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet room. To the U.S. Marshal. About Silas. Abby's breath hitched. She looked up. Did you force him? No. Wyatt set his cup down. I just gave him a choice. I leveled the ground. Told him he couldn't hide behind his badge and take a bribe at the same time. Silas will kill him. Wyatt. Silas will try. Wyatt's eyes were flat and hard, but he has to get through me first. Abby looked down at her coffee. The dark liquid caught the lamplight. You're risking your life for a town that hates you, she whispered. For a woman you barely know. Wyatt didn't answer right away. He reached into the canvas sack he had brought with him. He pulled something out. He laid it on the table, right between their coffee cups. It was his old trail coat, stiff, stained with alkali dust, and patched on the left shoulder with a square of heavy canvas. Abby stared at it. The blood drained from her face. She looked at the stitches. 45-degree angle, dark green thread, spaced exactly 1/8 of an inch apart. She knew that stitching. She saw it in her sleep. Wyatt rested his forearms on the table. He leaned in. I know you, he said. The rhythm of his words was slow, deliberate. I've known you since the winter of '72. Outside of Abilene, I was bleeding to death in the snow. You pulled me inside. You boiled the water. You sewed this patch so I wouldn't freeze on the ride south. Abby couldn't speak. Her throat was completely closed. I left a silver dollar on your table. Wyatt continued. I rode away before the sun came up. I was afraid the men tracking me would find your cabin. I didn't want to bring death to your door. Abby swallowed hard. I found the dollar. I kept it for a long time. Why didn't you say anything? Wyatt asked. He wasn't angry, he was just asking. When I brought my saddlebags in, you saw the stitches. You knew it was me. Abby looked up at him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Because I didn't want a debt, she said softly. You treated me like a human being, Wyatt. You looked me in the eye. You paid me a fair wage. If I told you I saved your life, you would have felt obligated to protect me. I didn't want your protection if it was bought. I wanted it only if it was freely given. Wyatt stared at her. He had met tough men. Men who could take a bullet and keep riding. Men who could break wild horses. But he had never met anyone with the sheer, unbreakable steel of Abigail Preston. She would rather suffer in silence than force a man to be kind to her out of obligation. Wyatt reached across the table. He didn't take her hand. He just rested his calloused fingers on the wood, inches from hers. An anchor. You don't owe me anything, Abby, he said, and I don't owe you. We're just two people who got left in the dirt trying to stand back up. He pulled his hand back. He picked up his coffee cup. You asked me why I'm risking my neck, Wyatt said. He looked at the wall, seeing something far away. I'll tell you, the man who shot me in the back that winter, he wasn't a stranger. He was my partner. Abby sat very still. We built a herd together, Wyatt said. His voice was hollow now, stripped of emotion. That was how a man survived talking about the thing that broke him. We shared a fire for 5 years. I trusted him with my life. We sold the herd in Abilene. Made $10,000. I took my share and bought a ring. Paused. Wyatt paused. The silence in the room stretched out. I was going to marry a girl named Sarah, Wyatt said quietly. She was waiting for me in Fort Worth. But my partner, he had other plans. He wanted the whole 10,000, and he wanted Sarah. Abby closed her eyes. She felt the physical weight of his betrayal. We were riding out of Abilene, Wyatt said. He dropped back to check his cinch. I kept riding. Next thing I knew, a .44 slug shattered my shoulder. I went off my horse, hit the snow hard. Wyatt looked down at his own hands. He didn't even check to see if I was dead. He just took my horse, took the saddlebags with the money, and he rode south, rode straight to Sarah, told her I died on the trail, told her he was there to take care of her. Did she believe him? Abby whispered. She must have, Wyatt said. By the time my arm healed enough to hold the reins, I tracked them down to Galveston. They were already married. They took my money and bought a shipping company. They were happy. Wyatt looked at Abby. I stood across the street. I watched them walk out of a restaurant. I had my hand on my gun. I could have killed him right there in the sunlight. Why didn't you? Because of you, Wyatt said. Abby blinked. Me? When I was laying on your floor, out of my head with fever, I kept raving about revenge, Wyatt said. You put a cool cloth on my head. You didn't know if I could hear you. But you said something. You said, blood doesn't walk out blood. It just makes the stain bigger. Abby remembered that night. She remembered the rage burning off the dying cowboy on her floor. I realized standing in Galveston, Wyatt said, that if I pulled that trigger, I wasn't just killing him. I was killing the man you saved. I was letting his betrayal turn me into a murderer. So I turned around. I walked away. And I never trusted another living soul. Not until I walked into this shop. Abby felt a tear slip down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. What was his name? She asked. Wyatt traced the rim of his coffee cup. He was a tall man, Wyatt said. Red hair, quick to smile. Always had a joke ready. But you could always tell it was him by his right hand. He was missing the top joint of his index finger. Caught it in a dally rope when he was a kid. Abby stopped breathing. The world tilted. The walls of the small kitchen seemed to rush inward, suffocating her. Her hands flew to her mouth. The coffee cup in front of her tipped over. The dark liquid spilled across the table, dripping onto the floorboards. She didn't notice. Abby? Wyatt sat up straight. He saw the sheer, unadulterated horror in her eyes. Abby, what is it? Red hair, she choked out. She was shaking violently now. A missing joint on the right index finger. Yes, Wyatt said, his brow furrowed. You know him? Oh, God, Abby whispered. She pushed her chair back. It scraped loudly against the wood. She stood up, backing away from the table, backing away from Wyatt. Abby. Wyatt stood up. He didn't move toward her. He kept his hands visible, calming a spooked horse. Talk to me. His name, Abby said. Her voice was jagged, broken. His name was Jedediah Preston. Wyatt froze. The name hung in the air between them. Heavy, toxic. Jedediah Preston, Arthur's oldest brother. The pieces slammed together in Wyatt's mind with the force of a train wreck. The Preston family. Arthur, the weak man who signed the fraudulent papers. Silas, the cruel man who orchestrated the theft and blackmailed the sheriff, and Jedediah, the eldest, the man who had shot Wyatt in the back and stolen his life. They were all cut from the same rotten cloth. A bloodline of thieves, cowards, and betrayers, and Abigail carried their name. Abby wrapped her arms around her own stomach. She looked like she was going to be sick. The shame was radiating off her in waves. I'm a Preston, she sobbed. The wall she had built for 3 years finally cracked. The fortress crumbled. I carry the name of the man who ruined your life. My husband helped ruin this town. My brother-in-law is bleeding it dry. And the man who shot you, he was family. She squeezed her eyes shut. I'm dirty, Wyatt, she wept. The whole town sees it, and now you see it. It's in the name. It's on me. I can't scrub it off. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He didn't care about propriety. He didn't care about the rules. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He reached out and grabbed her by the shoulders. His grip was firm. Not painful, but completely unyielding. Grounding her to the earth, pinning her to the present moment. Open your eyes, Abby, he commanded. She shook her head. The tears were coming fast now. Open your eyes and look at me. The gravel in his voice demanded obedience, not out of dominance, but out of desperation to pull her back from the ledge. Abby opened her eyes. Wyatt was looking down at her. His face was inches from hers. The lamplight caught the hard angles of his jaw, the deep lines around his eyes. There was no disgust in his face, no anger. "Listen to me very carefully," Wyatt said. His voice was a physical force in the room. "You are not Jedediah. You are not Silas. You are not Arthur. But I wear their name," she cried. "A name is just letters on a piece of paper." Wyatt fired back. "It does not own you. You hear me? A woman is not a piece of property that absorbs the sins of the man who buys her a ring." He gave her a slight shake, just enough to break her spiral. "Society tells you that you belong to your husband's family," Wyatt said, his words ringing with absolute, explicit truth. "They tell you his shame is your shame. That is a lie. It is a lie designed to keep women chained to the mistakes of foolish men." Abby stared at him. Her breathing was shallow, ragged. "We are not defined by the sins of the men who share our last name," Wyatt continued. He softened his grip. His thumbs gently rubbed the tension in her shoulders. "Your worth is entirely your own, Abigail. You earned it with every stitch you sewed. You earned it when you pulled a dying stranger out of the snow. Earned it when you took the town's abuse without turning cruel yourself." He leaned closer. His voice dropped to a fierce whisper. "The right to seek happiness is a privilege you have earned with your own blood and tears. And I swear to Almighty God, I will not let you strip yourself of it just because of the men you were unfortunate enough to be tethered to." Abby looked up into his eyes. She saw the truth there. Wyatt Callahan wasn't looking at a Preston. He was looking at Abigail, just Abigail. The guilt that had been crushing her chest for 3 years suddenly fractured. She let out a long, shuddering breath. Her legs gave out a little. Wyatt caught her. He pulled her against his chest. He wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in her dark hair. He didn't hold her like a lover. Not yet. He held her like a shield. Abby pressed her face into the rough canvas of his shirt. She smelled dust, leather, and horses. It was the safest smell in the world. She brought her arms up. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't endure the cold alone. She wrapped her arms tightly around Wyatt's waist. She held on to him just as hard as he held on to her. They stood there in the quiet kitchen. 2 broken people, betrayed by the exact same bloodline, finding the only piece of solid ground left in Texas. "You aren't dirty, Abby," Wyatt whispered into her hair. "You're the only clean thing I've found in 6 years. Trouble doesn't always kick the door down. Sometimes it just walks in and buys a cigar." Silas Preston arrived in Dusty Creek on a Friday. He didn't ride a sweaty horse. He rode in a polished black buggy, pulled by 2 matching bays. He wore a gray broadcloth suit, a silk cravat, a silver pocket watch. He looked like a banker. He smiled like a butcher. 2 men rode on horseback behind his buggy, hard men, the kind of men who wore their guns low and their hat brims pulled down to hide dead eyes. Wyatt was standing outside the livery when the buggy rolled past. He watched the wheels cut through the dust. He knew exactly who was sitting on that leather seat. Silas didn't stop at the saloon. He didn't stop at the jailhouse. He drove straight to the end of Main Street. He stopped the buggy right in front of the Seamstress shop. Inside the shop, Abby was showing Betsy how to measure a hem. When she heard the rattle of the buggy springs, she looked out the window. Her hands went perfectly still. "Betsy," Abby said. Her voice was flat, stripped of all panic. "Go into the back room. Close the door. Do not come out until I tell you." Betsy looked out the window. She saw the men. She saw the guns. Mrs. Preston. Now, Betsy. The girl ran to the back. The door clicked shut. Abby wiped her hands on her apron. She stood up straight. She walked to the center of the room and waited. The front door opened. The little brass bell clattered. Silas stepped inside. He took off his bowler hat. He looked around the small shop, his lips curling into a sneer of pure amusement. "Abigail," Silas said. His voice was smooth, oiled. "Look at you, still playing the martyr in the dirt. State your business, Silas, or get out." Silas chuckled. He walked over to a bolt of blue cotton. He ran a clean, manicured finger over the fabric. "I hear things in Red River," Silas said. "I hear a certain cowboy has been making noise, scrubbing your porch, sitting in your pew. And I hear my sheriff is getting nervous, sweating, writing letters he shouldn't be writing." Abby didn't blink. "Samuel's conscience is his own. Samuel doesn't have a conscience. He has a dying wife." Silas turned to face her. The smile vanished. "You tell your cowboy to ride it out today, and you tell Samuel to burn whatever paper he's been staring at. Because if you don't, Abigail, things are going to get very difficult for you." "They've been difficult for 3 years, Silas. You can't do anything more to me." "Can't I?" Silas looked toward the back room. His eyes narrowed. "I know who you're hiding back there," Silas said softly. "Elizabeth Tucker, daughter of William Tucker, the man who drank himself to death after he lost his farm, because of my brother's unfortunate business venture." Abby's heart slammed against her ribs. She kept her face entirely blank. "She's an orphan?" Silas continued, taking a step closer. "Underage, without a legal guardian. I have friends in San Antonio, Abigail. Friends who run the state orphanage. It's a hard place. Cold floors, cruel matrons. Girls go in there and they don't come out. Not as themselves. Anyway." Abby felt the air leave her lungs. "You open that locked box of Arthur S.," Silas hissed, stepping right up to her. "You say one word to the marshal, and I will have the state take that girl by sunset. I will put her in a hell you cannot imagine." The door of the shop opened again. It didn't swing. It hit the interior wall with the force of a cannon shot. Silas jumped back. His two hired guns stepped up onto the porch, reaching for their irons. They froze. Wyatt Callahan was standing in the doorway. He didn't have his gun drawn. He didn't need to. He took up the entire frame of the door. His face was carved out of granite. His eyes were focused on Silas with a terrifying, absolute calm. Wyatt stepped into the room. He didn't look at the hired men. He walked straight towards Silas. He didn't stop until he was standing between Silas and Abby. A human wall of muscle, leather, and quiet fury. Silas swallowed. He tried to puff out his chest. "Callahan, you have no business here. This is a family matter." "You don't have a family, Silas," Wyatt said. His voice was barely a whisper, but it filled every corner of the room. "You just have victims." "You think you can stop me?" Silas sneered, pointing a finger around Wyatt's broad shoulders at Abby. "I know her secret. I know why she stayed in this miserable town. I can take that orphan girl away with a snap of my fingers. That's power, cowboy." Wyatt didn't move. He looked down at Silas. He let the silence stretch. Let the rich man feel the weight of a man who couldn't be bought. "That isn't power," Wyatt said. He spoke clearly, every word a lesson. "Threatening a child to control a woman isn't power. It's the desperate act of a coward who knows his time is up." Wyatt took one step forward. Silas stumbled back, bumping into the sewing counter. "Real power," Wyatt continued, "is what this woman has been doing for 3 years. She had offers to leave this town. She had a friend in San Antonio willing to give her a job, good pay, a clean slate. I checked the telegraph records," Abby gasped. She hadn't told anyone that. Wyatt looked back at Abby. His eyes were soft for a fraction of a second. Then they hardened again as he turned back to Silas. She turned those offers down, Wyatt said. She chose to stay here. She chose to be spit on, ignored, and starved. Why? So she could keep a roof over the head of a girl whose life you ruined. She gave up her own freedom to shield a child from your sins. Silas stared. The two hired guns on the porch shifted nervously. They were being paid to shoot, not to listen to a sermon. But neither man wanted to draw on Wyatt Callahan. Wyatt leaned down. His face was an inch from Silas's ear. "You think you have her trapped," Wyatt whispered, "but you're the one in the corner." "The U.S. Marshal is already on a train from Austin. Sheriff Becker sent the wire this morning." Silas went pale. "You're lying." "I don't lie to dead men," Wyatt said. "You have exactly 10 seconds to get out of my sight. If I see your buggy in this town, when the sun goes down, I'm not going to arrest you. I'm going to bury you." Wyatt stood up. He pointed to the door. Silas looked at Wyatt. He looked at the massive Colt strapped high on Wyatt's hip. Silas was a man who used ledgers and lawyers. He didn't understand men who were willing to die for a principle. Silas grabbed his bowler hat. He scrambled toward the door. "Let's go," he snapped at his men. They practically ran to the buggy. Silas whipped the horses. The buggy tore down the street in a cloud of thick, choking dust, fleeing. The shop was silent again. Wyatt watched the buggy disappear. He didn't relax his shoulders. Abby was staring at his back. She walked slowly to the door of the back room. She opened it. Betsy was sitting on the floor, her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. She had heard everything. Abby knelt down. She pulled the tall, gangly girl into her arms. She held her tight, rocking her. Wyatt turned around. He looked at the two of them on the floor. "You stayed for her," Wyatt said. "It wasn't a question." Abby nodded against Betsy's hair. "Her father lost everything. He shot himself in the livery stable. Her mother died of a broken heart a month later. Silas did that. Arthur? Let him. When I saw Betsy sleeping in the hay, I knew I couldn't leave her. I couldn't give her a proper home because the town wouldn't allow me to legally adopt her. So I just taught her to sew. I paid for her meals. I kept her close." Wyatt walked over. He crouched down beside them. "Why didn't you just take her with you to San Antonio?" he asked gently. "Because Silas' men were watching me," Abby said. "If I tried to leave with the girl, they would have taken her. They needed leverage to ensure I never opened Arthur's box. As long as I stayed here and played the pariah, they felt safe. Betsy was my anchor, but she was also my prisoner." Wyatt reached out. He placed a heavy, warm hand on the crown of Betsy's head. Then he looked at Abby. "There's a difference between a prisoner and a survivor," Wyatt said. The lesson was explicit, clear as spring water. A prisoner is kept in the dark. A survivor is kept alive. You sacrificed your own name so this girl could have a future. Don't you ever call that a prison, Abby? That is the purest kind of love I have ever seen." Betsy looked up. She wiped her nose with her sleeve. She looked at Abby. "You stayed here, in this awful place, just for me?" Betsy whispered. "You are worth it, Elizabeth," Abby said fiercely. "You hear me? You are worth every hard look, every muddy dress. Women have to protect each other in this world, because nobody else is going to do it for us." Wyatt stood up. He offered a hand to Abby. She took it. He pulled her to her feet with ease. "We need the box, Abby," Wyatt said. "The marshal will be here by morning. Samuel's word isn't enough to hang Silas. We need the proof." Abby didn't hesitate. She didn't shake. She reached into the collar of her dress. She pulled out a small iron key on a leather string. She lifted it over her head. She walked to her sewing machine. She moved the heavy iron base. Underneath it was a loose floorboard. She pried it up. She pulled out a small, dust-covered wooden box. She handed it to Wyatt. "Open it," she said. Wyatt fit the key into the lock. It turned with a heavy click. Inside was a stack of ledgers, banknotes, and sitting on top, a sealed envelope, written in Arthur Preston's handwriting, to the authorities of the state of Texas. Wyatt picked up the letter. He looked at Abby. The weight of 3 years of silent suffering was sitting right in his palm. "It's over, Abby," Wyatt said. "No," Abby said. Her chin lifted. "It's just beginning. The U.S." Marshall rode into Dusty Creek at dawn. He brought 6 deputies. They carried repeating rifles and federal warrants. They didn't go to the saloon. They went straight to the hotel where Silas Preston was packing his bags. They brought him out in iron cuffs. The town woke up to the sound of chains clinking against the wooden boardwalk. By noon, the entire population of Dusty Creek was standing in the street outside the jailhouse. The sun was merciless. There was no wind. The air felt thick, charged with the kind of electricity that precedes a lightning strike. Sheriff Samuel Becker stood on the porch of the jail. He wasn't slouching today. He stood tall. Beside him was the U.S. Marshal, and standing right in the center of the porch, looking out over the crowd, was Abigail Preston. Wyatt Callahan stood just behind her right shoulder. He wasn't holding her up. He was just watching her back. The crowd was dead silent. Martha Higgins was standing in the front row, clutching her parasol like a weapon. The Reverend was beside her, looking nervous. Samuel Becker stepped forward. He held a piece of paper in his hand, the letter from the box. "Folks," Samuel said. His voice echoed off the buildings. "For 3 years, this town has lived under a cloud built on a lie. We blamed a woman for the sins of the men around her." He held up the letter. This was written by Arthur Preston, 3 days before he died. He hid it. It details exactly how his brother, Silas, forged the deeds, stole the money, and bribed the law. Arthur names the bank accounts. He names the accomplices. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Samuel raised his voice. "Arthur also wrote this, and I want every man and woman in this street to hear it clear." Samuel cleared his throat and read from the paper. "I am a weak man, but my wife, Abigail, is a righteous woman. She knew nothing of the theft. When she found out, she begged me to go to the law. I refused. I let her take the blame because I was a coward. If there is any soul in this family deserving of respect, it is her." Samuel lowered the letter. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Martha. "Abby Preston didn't steal your money," Samuel said. "She didn't plot against you. She stayed in this town, taking your abuse, simply to protect the Tucker girl from Silas's revenge. She is innocent, fully and completely." The silence that followed was heavy. It was the silence of deep, collective shame. People looked down at their boots. Men took off their hats. The women who had splashed mud on Abby's porch suddenly couldn't meet her eye. Martha Higgins stood rigid. Her face was pale. She knew her own secret, her daughter's secret, was still safely locked in Abby's heart. Abby had taken the town's hatred and Martha's abuse, and had never once used Emily's tragedy to defend herself. Abby stepped to the edge of the porch. She looked at the faces, the people who had starved her, the people who had treated her like a disease. Wyatt watched her. He knew this was the moment a lesser person would scream. A lesser person would demand blood, but Abby wasn't a lesser person. "I don't want your pity," Abby said. Her voice carried. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a quiet, piercing clarity. "And I don't need your apologies." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. "An apology?" Abby continued, won't give me back the mornings I had to walk in the shadows. It won't wash the mud off my porch. It won't erase the names you called me. She looked directly at the Reverend. You cannot break a person for 3 years and then expect a piece of paper to fix it. Then she looked directly at Martha Higgins. Martha flinched, expecting the blow, expecting her daughter's name to be dragged out into the harsh sunlight. But I am making a choice today, Abby said. The rhythm of her words slowed down, anchoring the lesson deep into the dirt of Dusty Creek. I choose to forgive this town, not because you have earned it. You haven't. I choose to forgive you because I deserve to sleep at night. I choose forgiveness because carrying your hatred is too heavy a burden, and I am putting it down. Abby stood tall, her shoulders back. Let this be a lesson to every soul standing in the dirt right now, Abby declared, stating the ultimate truth. Never strip another human being of their right to stand equal among you. A community is only as strong as the people it protects. When you throw out your weakest, you rot from the inside out. She held Martha S. gaze for one long, profound second. A silent transmission. Your secret is safe. Be better. Martha Higgins' lower lip trembled. Her self-righteous armor finally shattered. Slowly, painfully, Martha lowered her parasol. She bowed her head. I am sorry, Martha whispered. Then she raised her voice so everyone could hear. I am sorry, Mrs. Preston. It was the first time in 3 years anyone had called her that with respect. Abby didn't smile. She just nodded. She turned around. She didn't wait for the rest of the town to apologize. She didn't need their validation anymore. She walked down the steps of the jailhouse. Wyatt fell into step beside her. They walked down the center of Main Street. Together, Betsy was waiting on the porch of the shop, her face beaming. The crowd parted. But this time, they didn't shrink away in disgust. They stepped aside in reverence. 6 months later, the heat of the summer had finally broken. The autumn wind, blowing through Dusty Creek, tasted like pine needles and fresh rain. Abby S. Seamstress' shop looked different. The front wall had been torn out and replaced. In its center was a massive, beautiful pane of glass. A window looking right out onto Main Street. Abby no longer hid behind drawn curtains. She let the light pour in. Inside, Betsy was pinning a dress on a paying customer, the banker's wife. The town had slowly trickled back. It was awkward at first, but Abby's needlework was unmatched, and her grace was undeniable. The little bell above the door rang. Wyatt walked in. He took off his hat. He brushed the sawdust off his denim trousers. He had just finished framing the new corral at his ranch. Abby looked up from her sewing machine. She smiled. It was a real smile. It reached all the way to her eyes. You're early, she said. Finish the fence, Wyatt said. He walked over to her counter. He set a small, wrapped paper package on the wood. What's this? Open it, Abby set her scissors down. She untied the twine. She folded back the brown paper. Inside was a small leather book, a ledger. She opened the cover. The handwriting inside was elegant. Official. It was an adoption certificate, signed by the circuit judge in Red River. Elizabeth Tucker was now legally Elizabeth Callahan. Abby's breath caught. She traced the ink with her finger. Wyatt? The judge signed it this morning, Wyatt said softly. Betsy has a family now, a real one. The law recognizes it. Abby looked up at him. Callahan, you gave her your name. Wyatt rested his forearms on the counter. He looked deep into her eyes. I've got another paper in my saddlebag, Wyatt said. His voice was that low, steady rumble that made her feel entirely safe. A marriage license. It's blank, waiting on a signature. Abby stared at him. Her heart did a slow, heavy roll in her chest. "Wyatt Callahan," she whispered. "Are you asking me out of obligation? Because you feel sorry for what I went through," Wyatt said, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his weathered face. "I don't feel sorry for you. I'm in awe of you. You're the strongest thing I've ever seen on two legs. I'm not asking to protect you. You don't need protecting. I'm asking because I want to build something, and I only want to build it with you." He reached across the counter. He took her calloused hand in his. "You want to stay in Dusty Creek?" he asked. "I never wanted to leave," Abby said. "I just wanted to be allowed to live in it." "Then we live in it," Wyatt said. "Together." Abby looked at the man who had sat in the empty chair, the man who had scrubbed her porch, the man who had looked at a town full of hate and simply refused to participate. She squeezed his hand. "Yes," Abigail said. "I'll sign it." Outside, the wind blew through the dusty streets. The town hadn't changed overnight. Hearts are stubborn things, and prejudice dies a slow death. But as Abigail Preston stood in the light of her new window, holding the hand of the man who chose her, she knew the truth. The smallest, most patient stitch eventually holds the whole fabric together. And for the first time in her life, the thread wasn't pulling her apart. It was pulling her home. Some characters in this story may display flawed judgment, emotional instability, or morally questionable choices as part of their personal journeys. These portrayals are intended to explore human emotion and conflict within a fictional context and should not be interpreted as guidance or endorsement.
That window is everything. She didn't draw the curtains anymore. She let the light pour in. That is what this story is about. Not the villain. Not the fraud. Not even the love story. It is about the long, brutal, patient act of refusing to disappear when the world decides you should. Abigail Preston did not fight back with fire. She did not drag her enemies into the street. She did not use the weapons she held, and she held devastating ones. She knew Martha Higgins's most fragile secret. She knew where the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively. She could have burned her tormentors to the ground at any moment and walked away clean. She didn't. Not because she was weak, but because she understood something most people spend a lifetime missing. You never use a sister's tragedy to build your own armor. You never hand a person's pain to a crowd as ammunition, even when that person has done you nothing but harm. That is not softness. That is a discipline so fierce and so rare that the town of Dusty Creek, in its collective shame, had no language for it. They only knew how to read cruelty. They had never seen anything like Abby before, and so they called it guilt. They called it what they wanted it to be, because the truth, that she was simply better than all of them, was too uncomfortable to hold. The second wound this story presses on is the wound of inherited shame. Abby Preston wore a name that didn't belong to her sin. She carried the stain of men who had used her, discarded her, and hidden behind her skirts. And when the grief of it finally broke her open in that small kitchen, she said the thing that every person who has ever been defined by someone else's failures has felt in their bones. I'm dirty. The whole town sees it. It's in the name. It's on me. I can't scrub it off. And Wyatt Callahan, a man who had every reason in the world to agree with her, grabbed her by the shoulders and named the lie for exactly what it was. A woman is not a piece of property that absorbs the sins of the man who buys her a ring. She did not become the Prestons' corruption by marrying into their name any more than she would have become a horse by sleeping in their barn. Society constructed that chain to keep women accountable for men's sins, because a woman who cannot be blamed is a woman who cannot be controlled. Abby's worth was entirely, indestructibly her own. She earned it stitch by stitch. She earned it in the dark of a Wyoming winter, sewing a patch on a dying stranger's coat without asking his name or his reasons. She earned it on every single morning she walked through a hostile town, with her chin level and her back straight, choosing dignity over bitterness for 3 years straight. And then there is Betsy, the 16-year-old girl sleeping in livery stable hay. The real reason Abby never left. This is the heart of the story. Not the romance, not the reckoning, not even the truth finally spoken from the jailhouse steps. The heart is a woman who had every door open to her, every exit lit, every reasonable excuse to save herself. And she chose to stay in the dirt because a child needed a roof over her head. She paid for that choice with 3 years of her reputation, her livelihood, her social existence, her peace of mind.